Joining me now to talk more about offshore wind energy globally is Alexander Flotre. He's the VP and Head of Offshore Wind Research in Rystad Energy. Alexander, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here. Let me start with this question. Is onshore wind the low-hanging fruit that has been largely picked globally? And if yes, would that mean offshore is where the future growth of this industry lies?
Thank you for having me and on the show. And yes, you could definitely say that onshore wind has been the low-hanging fruit. We've seen onshore renewables been the start of the growth of renewable capacity globally. Onshore wind and solar has grown substantially and are in size much larger markets than what offshore wind is currently at. So, towards 2025, we still think that onshore wind and solar will remain, the large share of the renewable energy markets in terms of capacity. But offshore wind is definitely one of the most, fastest growing market in terms of capacity growth. So that has to do with the fact that, the onshore areas are starting to get very populated in the most established regions, and that most of the developments need to kind of be moved offshore to enable the continued growth of renewable energy. At the same time, we still see very substantial growth, especially in China and India, in onshore renewables as well.
Alexander, offshore wind is pretty established in Europe, where the UK is the biggest offshore market in the world. But the US has big plans off its continental shelf under the Biden administration. Where else globally are there plans for growth in offshore wind? Would you kindly give us a global snapshot of offshore wind plans and projects currently?
Sure. Yeah. No. So definitely, as you say, Europe has been the biggest driver of the offshore wind market in the early days. It is the most mature region. Currently, 70 to 80% of the capacity has come from Europe, with UK being the global leader. We do see currently in the short to medium term that China is definitely driving the global markets. China went into 2020 with a 10 plus gigawatt capacity backlog. They have a feed-in tariff that will start being phased out post-2021, and that is driving a very kind of large activity surge in China in this year. We also expect it to continue next year, although the feed-in tariffs are slightly kind of being phased out. So we definitely see, China driving the global offshore wind market in the short to medium term. But then towards 2025, as we expect China to start being kind of ramping down its activity due to the kind of phasing out of the feed-in tariffs, we also expect other Asian countries, such as Taiwan and Vietnam, especially in the short to medium term, and then also South Korea, Japan, and other Asian countries to start offsetting that slowdown in China. We also expect a continuation in Europe with the more established countries such as the UK, Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, as well as newcomer France really starting to pick up pace as well. And then we see momentum being gained in other countries in Europe, such as Poland and elsewhere as well. For the US, definitely a lot of momentum with the Biden administration really putting a lot of backing to the offshore wind sector. But we mainly see the biggest growth coming in the second half of this decade.
How has offshore wind investments and grid connections fared in 2020 in light of the pandemic? And what is expected for these projects this year?
Yeah, no, so definitely offshore wind has been one of the more robust parts of the energy industry through the pandemic. We've seen investments increasing to new heights. Last year, around 35 billion USD in sanctioned investments for offshore wind farms. That's a 300% growth year on year compared to the previous year, and that's also expected to grow in the next coming years. So it's been very robust. We've seen nations and developers sticking to their ambitions and even raising their ambitions throughout the pandemic. To give one example, in Europe in the second quarter of 2020, in the midst of the market uncertainty and a lot of turmoil in the global energy markets, we saw around 4 gigawatts of sanctioned offshore wind capacity in that quarter alone in Europe, compared to around 1.4 gigawatts in the year ahead. So that's more than almost a tripling of the sanctioned capacity in one quarter compared to the previous year in total. So we definitely see a very strong offshore wind market, and that's due to the kind of the accelerated energy transition, as we see as a means to also kind of reboot different economies around the world. When it comes to commissioned capacity, we saw quite a flat development last year, around 6.2 gigawatts of capacity being fully commissioned and put into operation, and that's partly driven by this pickup in activity in China. China is also going to drive this year's capacity growth, and we do actually see quite of a step change in activity levels in 2021, with around 13 gigawatts of new capacity coming online, with more than 50% of that coming from China.
But Alexander, the levelized cost of offshore wind energy is still much higher compared to other alternatives. How can offshore wind projects bring down those costs?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we are seeing it in recent years. One of the key parts of the offshore wind farms in itself are the turbines and the cost of the turbines. I think we've seen a very rapid technology development in the turbine technology in terms of sizes of these components to reach a larger scale and to reap the benefits of that scale that is achieved. That will also reduce the count of different components to maintain and also install, which creates the kind of the whole picture economics to be lower. At the same time, I think it's important to not only look at LCOEs, it's also about the scale of the developments that can be achieved offshore, and that the fact that while offshore might be a little bit more expensive, it is an important means for the different nations to reach their climate targets. So in that sense, I think it's one of the solutions, and not just a competition between the different energy sources.
Alexander, let's talk about differing offshore technologies. What potential does floating offshore wind hold compared to fixed offshore projects? What are the advantages and challenges of the floating one?
Yeah. No, I think if we're talking potential for floating offshore wind, the sky's the limit. 80% of the offshore wind capacity potential in the world is in floating specific regions. So what floating then can do as the key advantage is to unlock these new areas where bottom fixed or grounded offshore wind cannot reach with the current technology. I think that it will enable us to move farther out from shore into more to areas with higher wind speeds to get up the capacity factors of these developments, which is clearly a benefit for these developments to improve project economics and to get more output out of these large installations. But we do see floating offshore wind as primarily a story of the 2030s and beyond. That doesn't mean that the 2020s will not be an important decade for floating wind. This is, a very, a pivotal decade for floating wind, in the sense that we'll expect to see large cost reductions in the floating industry as it matures towards reaching commercial levels and being more competitive with the bottom fixed segment. But we do still see that there are a lot of challenges, and to really get the ball rolling, floating wind needs to reach that same kind of industrialization and scale as we have now recently experienced in bottom fixed offshore wind. So to really start to get the ball rolling, we probably need additional subsidies and support schemes to get to that larger scale, and seeing economies of scale for floating offshore wind as well. And then in addition, there are definitely technical challenges when you start to move into larger utility scale floating offshore wind farms. It's on the transmission infrastructure, it's on the mooring of these, it's on the maintenance and operations of these large units, which some of these challenges are yet to be solved. The positive thing is that most of these concepts and these technologies do already exist in a certain way, or in a kind of a quite similar shape or form in the oil and gas industry and other adjacent industries. So I do think that we will be able to solve those challenges towards the end of this decade.
Alexander, how can green hydrogen and offshore wind be paired, and what is their joint potential?
Yeah, I think it's a longer-term solution to solve a lot of the intermittency issues with offshore wind. I think we are seeing a trend of a lot of hub solutions in the offshore wind space. We've seen the Danish authorities approving the energy islands in Denmark. We've seen South Korea going out with large hub plans for their 8.2 gigawatt projects. I think in these type of hubs where you can get power to X and then hydrogen being one of those solutions, can definitely solve a lot of the intermittency and thus improve the kind of the larger project or hub economics. It's a means of storage to solve the fact that we aren't able to make use of the full potential from offshore wind due to the intermittency and the kind of the variance in demand as well. So I think it's an important piece. Currently, we're not seeing the costs being there, but due to the expected cost reductions that we also forecast to see towards the end of this decade in electrolyzer capacities and so forth, we think it will be a more important piece for every year that passes.
Alexander, do you think that with offshore wind energy, a more stable resource or a more stable source of energy can be used in producing green hydrogen as well?
Yes, definitely. I think there are definite ways to produce hydrogen from renewable energy and more stable solutions. That's definitely one of the issues or solutions, I would say. But I would also think about, it depends a little bit on the end use, whether you want to continuously kind of use it to produce a lot of hydrogen because you have the need for hydrogen in itself, or if hydrogen is the solution in itself to solve the intermittency of unstable kind of sources, such as offshore wind will be.